All right, friends, welcome back. Feels like it's been a long time having 2 days off from these. So hopefully you had a good weekend and a good experience finishing up numbers over the weekend and today. And if you've not, that's fine. You can always catch up. As I mentioned, I've been doing the usually the audio Bible in the morning, and then right before I sit down to do this, I'll go back through the printed Bible and underline certain things as well. And my Bible's getting pretty well full of underlines all over the place now. As a result of that, but I do see things. I'll admit for you, I don't like to listen. I want to read it the regular way people. I'll admit that sometimes I see things when I'm looking through it in the print copy that I don't pick up when I'm listening. So both have their advantages and disadvantages, perhaps. So I'm doing the kind of catch-all thing, but whatever it is that you're doing, it's good. It's better than what it would be if you weren't doing anything. So I'm going to flip through a lot here today. Hopefully not in long length or detail because kind of fell behind, but there's a good bit going on. So I'm going to pick up like in chapter 26 and just kind of flip through to the end, just picking up on a couple things that I think may be noteworthy. But feel free to leave comments about your observations about anything in the reading that I'm covering today, or just the completion of numbers. What do you think about numbers? Is it what you thought? Is it different than you thought? Is it better? Is it worse? Is it a mixed bag? Probably is the reality. Chapter 26 has a census, and I think probably, at least for me, probably for a lot of us, what we think that numbers is full of is just only in all these lists of different people and clans. We do see that is in here, but that's not even the majority, really, of what's going on here in this book. There's a lot more narratives that we've seen going on, a lot of good, a lot of bad rebellion and consequence. And so that has kind of gone on throughout this. At the conclusion of chapter 26, we have some comments that I think are just kind of worth noting. We have some numbers that are mentioned here, the totals. We have another list. I have one book that has the comparison of what the numbers are at the beginning, what the numbers are at the end, and some tribes get bigger, some tribes get smaller, but we also have to keep in mind that, remember, because of their rebellion and failure to trust God about giving them the land, this kind of the curse of the wandering is that all of that generation was going to die there in the wilderness. So this number here is reflective of the kind of reconstituted people when all of those who didn't trust God, who rebelled, that they're all kind of died off at this point. So this is that new generation that's coming up through who are in these numbers. And again, we have that really highlighted in verse 63. So chapter 26, verse 63 and following. These are the ones counted by Moses and Eleazar the priest. Remember, Eleazar is Aaron's son. He's kind of taken his place as the high priest now at this point. On the plains of Moab, by the Jordan, across from Jericho. I've not looked it up, but that phrase is repeated several times here at the end of Numbers. They are right on the edge of entering the promised land. They can almost see it across the river. They're on the plains just on the other side of the Jordan River that they will go across to enter into the promised land that God has for them. But in verse 64, it's highlighted, not one of them was among those counted by Moses and Aaron the priest when they counted the Israelites in the desert of Sinai. So that first big count, nobody who is in that count is in this count. He goes on to say, right? 4 verse 65, for the Lord had told those Israelites they would surely die in the wilderness, and not one of them was left except two guys. Do you remember who? Caleb and Joshua, the two of the 12 spies who came back and said, we can do it. The other one said, we can't do it. And they led everybody else in that rebellion. And so they are the only two who are able to enter the excuse me, the promised land. I could use a little bit of something, but I don't have anything there. Oh well. Okay. So very important. Joshua is given to succeed Moses. I think I maybe mentioned this in a video already. I'm not sure, but that's really significant there. The Lord, I just mentioned it at the end, I think, but spend some time on reflecting on that if you haven't. Chapter 27, the paragraph like in verse 15 and following. So the Lord's people will not be like a sheep without a shepherd. Moses is going to die. God tells him, but he doesn't want to leave the people abandoned. All right, chapter 28. We're kind of shifting gears. We have more of the sacrifice stuff. We've learned about this some in Exodus, a lot in Leviticus. This is interesting because it gives us the kind of everyday baseline expectations at the beginning of chapter 28. So what do we see here? 2 burnt offerings. Remember, the burnt offering is all in, all burned up before the Lord, not for any specific sin wrong, but just as kind of general approach to God living in their presence. And so we see the kind of the baseline of that. It's not this continual parade necessarily of sacrificial offerings, but there's 2 a day, one at the beginning of the day, one at the end of the day. And now people would bring their offerings throughout the day, perhaps, but it's not like there's just tons and tons of animals as the baseline. They would bring other animals that would become the fellowship offering, that they would actually eat a lot of the meat, and that was, a regular practice. And then, of course, if they came across things that they realized in hindsight that they had unintentionally sinned or that they need to be purified for one of the reasons given, that they would come for those things as well. But those aren't highlighted here. And then we come through and see the Sabbath day, the 1 day a week. There would be additional offerings, sacrifices on that day. And we have throughout these continually, in addition to. So these don't replace the daily ones. They're in addition to. And then throughout the different festivals of the year, what the appropriate sacrificial offerings would be for that. As well, in chapter 29, like in verse 7, the Day of Atonement, we see that there. But interestingly, that this is only focused in on the animals that are offered on the altar, so to speak. The goat, that's the scapegoat that goes out into the wilderness, which is a core part of the Day of Atonement, is not in this description, at least that I can see. It's only the offerings that are kind of given there. So, okay, chapter 30, bouncing along, is interesting. We need to know that we take vows and oaths very, very seriously. When a man makes a vow or an oath, takes a pledge, he must not break his word, but must do everything he has said. But here's an interesting other situation that we probably don't like, but it kind of is what it is here to process. Women are a bit different. So if a woman makes a vow or a pledge, depending on her circumstance, if she's still kind of at home, a young woman, if her father doesn't have a problem with it, it stands. But the text here kind of gives us an indication that the father kind of has a veto right, so that if his teenage daughter makes a vow or a pledge that he's like, whoa, what are you doing? That he can override that, but if not, then it stands. So given some autonomy here, but yet underneath the kind of larger household. And that larger household also holds true at this time with married relationships. So if in a similar way, if a married woman, so this is like in verse 1 verse 6 says, if she marries after she takes a vow, her husband has some ability there. Verse 9, if a woman is a widow or divorced, there's no caveats. The vow that she makes just kind of stands as it is. but the similar situation with the woman and her husband. I think the idea here is maybe like household, this kind of household structure. We see most of the censuses and things that are organized by kind of men as head of tribes, head of clans, heads of household. That this kind of household unit has a responsible person who's the father, the husband, the kind of man of the house, if you will, is kind of the representative of that household unit, such that in this case, in this context, he has kind of veto, if you will, rights over a pledge that his wife or daughter makes. But it's not. It doesn't say that she has to run it by him or just suggest it to him. She can make a vow or a pledge on her own behalf, whether a young woman at home or an adult married woman. And if the husband or the father doesn't have a problem with it, then it just goes. But he can have a sort of veto right. I'm sure there's more behind this. I didn't research this to kind of look into it. I'm just kind of giving my thoughts as kind of process through chapter. This is really an interesting kind of grab bag's probably the wrong word, but a lot of different things happening here towards the end of Numbers. Chapter 31, they're instructed to take revenge on the Midianites, people that wanted to wipe them out. Now they're going to kind of do the opposite. A lot of stuff we could mention here. Interesting, we have a re-emergence of our buddy Balaam. Balaam dies in this conflict. Chapter 31, verse 8, we have reference to that. And then we have also more, so as we were kind of wrestling with Balaam and kind of, is he okay? Is he really problematic? And the back and forth of that. And I think I mentioned going forward, there's not anything really positive said about Balaam. Well, one of the things is here in verse 16, that there women, have you allowed the women, all the women to live? Yeah. So like sometimes like in these warfare situations, like the warriors would fight and you would kill the kind of the men who were fighting you, but the women, children, you would kind of let go. But he wants to separate here some of the women of the people they've defeated with the ones whom, remember, we saw led the people astray. They got into sexual relationships with them, and they drew them away to idolatry, to idol worship in the midst of those relationships. And those women have very big consequence for that. But Balaam is sort of blamed, right, for this in this too. Verse 16, chapter 31. They were the ones, these women, who followed Balaam's advice and enticed the Israelites to be unfaithful to the Lord at the Peor incident, Baal Peor. So this was not as clear to me in the earlier chapters with Balaam, but now we have this, there's more that was going on there on the tail end, that he apparently had encouraged these women to go and entice the Israelite men in this regard. So there you have that. Moving forward. Okay, chapter 32 is kind of interesting. So again, they're on the cusp of entering the promised land. And these two tribes in particular kind of say, hey, this land right here is pretty good. It's good for our livestock. There's some, it's a good place. There's some cities, some fortifications and stuff here already. Maybe we should just stay here. It seems good to us. So like verse 5, let this land be given to your servants as our possession. Do not make us cross the Jordan. So this is not really great because it's not the promised land. This is not what God promises people for a possession. But is it good? Is it not so good? It's kind of a mixed bag. Moses is not a big fan, at least at first, verse 6, because he thinks they're trying to get out of the conflict, right? So they still have yet ahead of them, like in order to fulfill God's promises, they've got to go and fight these kind of giants that they were afraid of, etc., that kind of kept them out of the from being afraid to enter the land. So they're like, you guys are just copping out and staying to stay here and let us go and fight all these things. That's not really cool. So Moses says, right, again, verse 6, like I said, should your fellow Israelites go to war while you sit here? And then he recounts that story that I mentioned about their rebellion and basically kind of accuses them of putting people in the same situation. Hey, if you stay here, is everyone just going to want to say, hey, we're just going to stay here? We're not going to go and into the land that God's promised us to give us. We're just going to stay here in this other land, and that's not going to be a good thing, right? God's going to get angry again, like before. So their response, this is like verse 16 and following, is, we'll go, we'll leave the women and the children here. We'll build places for them that seem safe. We will go, all the fighting guys will go with you. We'll go, and enter the land with you and fight the fights and all that. But when it's all done, we won't take any land in the promised land. We'll come back and occupy this land. So that seems good enough to Moses. In any case, there's a lot more you could sort of think about, and he's concerned that they won't make good on it. But of course, that's the deal. So it's the tribes of Gad and Reuben, and then Manasseh joins them too. We see that at the end of chapter 32. Those are those tribes. Chapter 33 is every single stop along the way of the wilderness journey. We saw, again, this kind of paradigm of God's presence led, this kind of cloud, this glory cloud of God's presence. When it went up, they went up and went. And when it stopped, they stopped. And it could have been a day, a week, a month, a year. They came and went as God led. And so this is like a recap, a recount of every single one of those stops along the way. It's not the most exciting reading, but it recounts for us where they had been. This is like a reverse GPS description of each turn, each stop there along the way. So again, and towards the end of chapter 33, verse 50, I mentioned earlier that this was a repetition again and again and again here. On the plains of Moab, by the Jordan, across from Jericho, the Lord said to Moses, they're in this spot, they're on the cusp. When you cross the Jordan into Canaan, drive out all the inhabitants of the land before you, and you must destroy all the carved images, all the idols, all their high places. All this other worship stuff has to go. It's got to go. Distribute the land by lot, and so everybody gets a place. The people that have more people get more land. The people that have less get less. Just kind of sort of makes sense. Chapter 35 describes the boundaries of the land, the promised land, where it starts, where it stops, east, north, south, east, west. Gives descriptions for that and where it is and where it isn't. We see that there. Chapter 35. Remember the Levites, those given to the work in and around the tabernacle. They don't get their own regions. They don't get an inheritance of land, but there's cities within all the different places, all the different tribal allotments, where there will be towns that the Levites that they will live in. There's 48 of these in total, spread all throughout. So the Levites will be dispersed all throughout the land, but they don't have a section, a spot. They don't have a state. They don't have state's the wrong, an anachronistic term. But if you have a country, then you have states. That's sort of like what ancient Israel is, the country. And then like we have the United States and then different states. It's much smaller, but you have these different tribes in different places. And then dotted all throughout that is these towns for the Levites. And there's a few, 6 particular cities that are known as cities of refuge. And we read in here that what's going on with this is that if somebody kills somebody unintentionally, again, we have a lot about unintentional stuff in the Bible here so far. So, and there's several cases that are given here, like in verse 16 and following, that if you kill somebody with an intent is kind of a big thing here. If there's an enemy and you go out and you hit him with a shovel, you hit them with a blog, and they die, then you're guilty, and your life is subject to death as well. That's the way that it is. But if there's an accident, if you're working with somebody and something falls on them, if you throw something and didn't see anybody there and they die, then you can go to one of these cities, and the person that would be sort of responsible from the party of the person that died, you would be safe there from their avenging in that kind of situation. So interesting kind of structure that's sort of built in here to give some level of protection from people that are that find themselves in this situation, what we would today call, I think, manslaughter, right? Not first-degree murder, not an intentional homicide, but you killed somebody. So the consequences is that they have to stay in that city, not in their home base, until the high priest dies. An interesting kind of timeline to be given, but that's kind of their consequences. You still got a consequence for manslaughter. You don't get to live at home. You live in this other city for a while, and then you're okay. So last but not least, kind of an odd ending, maybe in a sense, to Numbers, is in chapter 36, where these women. Interesting. There's a couple of times where women come to Moses and kind of say, "Well, what about this? What about this situation where everything is kind of organized by guys? Well, what if there's no guys in play? What do we do then?" And in these different circumstances, they're honored. Their requests are found to be reasonable and responded to in that circumstance. So in chapter 36, their concern is that if these women marry people in other tribes, then their lands will be shifted over, so that the inheritance for one tribe will shift to another if the women, there's no men in their families, and the women go over and marry from a different tribe, then that household will take over that land. And so the rule is you marry people in your own tribe, so that the land stays within the tribe, and that seems to be good. And that's the end. Again, the last thing is the repetition of that statement, that phrase that I mentioned. Verse 13, these are the commands and regulations the Lord gave through Moses to the Israelites on the plains of Moab, in the Jordan, across from Jericho. So they seem poised to enter the promised land. But we will tomorrow flip the page to Deuteronomy, and we're going to have kind of a reset of a lot of the story, and there's a lot more to read before Joshua, where we actually enter the promised land. So we think we're there, we're almost there, but we get a long pause for the book of Deuteronomy that we have to work through before we can get into the promised land. So there will be some repetition here, some condensing, some new stuff. Deuteronomy is going to be interesting, and hopefully we'll get the points by the time we leave. But again, feel free to share your thoughts, your questions. We're thinking big picture, what's going on. Hopefully we got some of that as we've walked through the book of Numbers. I will see you tomorrow. Bye.